but I have called you friends, because I have made known to you everything that I have heard from my Father. Now, Jesus knew that the disciples were going to run away. He knew that they were going to abandon him, but he still called them friends. They had done much work as disciples. They had helped feed the 5,000. They had assisted in crowd control. They had even gone out 2 by 2s throughout Judea, healing people, going to villages and speaking about the message of the Messiah. But nothing they did made them worthy of being friends of Jesus. All they did was listen to everything that he said and just did what he asked. Now, I want you to think about that for a second. Now, for those of you who work, how many of you have worked a job in your life sometime in here? All right. How many of you have owned a business? Anybody a business owner here? All right. So most everybody in here has worked for somebody else, right? Now, one thing I'm going to talk about, this idea of servant and master that Jesus talks about, we really don't get that a whole lot, but I would like to think of it, maybe translate in a different way, that boss and employee, okay? And the way I can tell is that when so I had this experience yesterday. I ended up shopping at 5 different stores in our community yesterday, getting everything ready for my garden, and I went to different places to get the best deal. But when I would walk into a store that was owned by a family in this community, I was treated a whole lot differently there than I am when I go to a place that is some wholly owned subsidiary of some mega corporation, right? Anybody ever feel that way? You walk in, you know the people behind the desk, and you'll end up having a good conversation, and they'll help you out, and they'll have a smile on their face. But then when you go to a different store and you're dealing with an employee, you may not get an answer, right? Or that's not my job, or go ask somebody else. You know, you see the difference between being an employee and being the boss? I'd like to argue that there's also a big difference between being a servant and a friend to somebody. Being a servant often implies a work relationship, that something is done in return for some sort of remuneration. But friendship implies equality, working together and caring for one another. So I understand the difference between working with somebody who's the boss and who knows intimately the details of their workplace versus somebody who is paid just to be there and work the 8 hours a day. Now, John Wesley struggled with something similar. He tried to figure out what it meant to be a Christian. And for the first half of his life, probably until he was about 35, 36 years old, he thought that being a Christian was meaning just you obey God's commandments, you do all that is right, and you ask for forgiveness for everything you've done wrong. And in fact, we have a lot of John Wesley's journals that have been kept and collated, and there's long books. I mean, his writings go on about 12 volumes, about 10,000 pages. And one thing that historians looked at, they looked at John Wesley's diaries that had each date on it. He used to put a black mark next to the date of every day that he sinned. All right? He was a little OCD, I think. But John Wesley would do that. And so after about 20 years of doing this, he realized, I've never not been without sin. And so it got him depressed. He's just thinking, I can never earn God's salvation. There's not enough good that I can do in this world to make up for all the bad that I do. So John Wesley really struggled with his call to being a minister, with his idea of what it meant to be a Christian, and even traveled to Georgia on a rickety ship to come and serve as a missionary for 2 years in Georgia before he went back home. But none of it was providing any satisfaction. And so one day he asked a friend of his, he says, I'm really thinking about just giving up this whole preaching thing. His friend said, no, you need to keep on preaching because God is going to give you faith. He said, preach faith till you have it, and then because you have it, you will preach faith. Now, a couple of months later, after this conversation he had with his friend, he woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning on May 24th, 1738. Again, we have all his journals, so we know what time it was. And he wrote, he prayed that God would help him through his struggles. And he was encouraged by some Bible verses that he read that day, but it wasn't until around 9 o'clock that night when he was wandering around London, and he found himself on a place called Aldersgate Street. In case you're ever wondering why there are so many Methodist churches named Aldersgate, it's because this is where John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed. He entered into this building. It was a Moravian church, and they were doing a Bible study on the book of Romans. They were reading aloud Martin Luther's preface to the letter on Romans. Now, if you've ever read any of Martin Luther, he is the most boring writer I've ever encountered in my life. And of course, he was writing in the 1530s, and it was translated from German to English, so it probably didn't make much sense. And yet John Wesley felt his heart strangely warmed, and he felt a rededication to God at that moment. Now, what we call it in our modern experience is that he had a born-again moment, where he felt like he totally understood that God and that God's love was for him, that all of his sins were forgiven, and nothing he could do could earn that forgiveness. John Wesley on that day moved from being a servant of God to just doing the things that we're told to do, to accepting the gift of love that God has given us through Jesus Christ. Now, all of us can choose to be a servant of God. We have the instruction booklet in front of us. It's called the Bible. And we could go through that book and we could say, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to do this. But too often I think that what leads us to walking off is that we can clock in on Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock and clock out at 10 o'clock and say, all right, I did my God time for this week. I can have the rest of the week off for myself. It's like being an employee, right? But what God tells us is that, we're more like a friend, which means that we do things not out of obligation or because we're trying to find some reward, but because we do it out of thankfulness for what God has done for us. Now, within a generation of those words being written about being a friend to Jesus, another leader of the church went even further in his description of the relationship between God and us. The author of 1 John tells us, everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been begotten of God, and everyone who loves the parent also loves the child. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments. And in the verses preceding this, in chapter 4, he writes, those who say, I love God, and hate their brothers or sisters are liars. For those who do not love a brother or sister whom they have seen cannot love God whom they have not seen. The commandment we have from him is this, those who love God must love their brothers and sisters also. So I want you to think about that for a moment. So here we all start off in this world thinking that our service to God is kind of like an employee-employer relationship. That we do things, we put our hours in, and God will give us heaven at the end. It's our divine pension, right? Well, Jesus takes it up a step further. He says, you're no longer my servants, you're now my friends. And then a generation later, writers in 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, the writer of that letter says, no, it's more like being adopted by God. We are begotten by God. We are made into a new creation, and we are kin to our God. Now, do y'all treat family different than you treat your friends? Do you treat your friends better than your family sometimes? Do you treat your boss and your employee different than your friends? I mean, I think we tend to think family is the closest, friends are a little bit further out there, and, a job is just a job, right? And so I would challenge you that in your relationship to God, I want you to think of it not just out of obligation or out of something that you feel like you have to do. Rather, think of it as what you would do for family. John Wesley struggled with understanding what God is and who God is and what is required of our faith. He struggled with assurance. He didn't know if God really loved him. Our struggles may be different. Some of us struggle with merely believing that God exists. How could God exist in this crazy world when everything seems to go wrong? Some of us struggle with how God could be loving to every human being, especially when we see the depth of evil in this world. And maybe our struggle rests in the fact that it's more God's love that does the work than our works that get us to where heaven can be. So our struggles get in the way. And we want to remain just servants working hard at a task. You see, being a friend requires more commitment. Being family to God even requires more understanding that God loves us. Indeed, Jesus tells his disciples that when he states that no one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for a friend. We are to love others as much as Jesus loves us. And that may mean we're called to give up our lives for that faith. The difference between being a servant and a friend is the voluntarily acceptance of doing something without receiving any earthly reward. And in this passage from the Gospel of chapter John 15, much is said about obeying commandments. Some of you may think that being a Christian means merely doing some things and not doing others. I mean, we got the instruction manual, don't we? Don't lie, don't steal, don't covet, don't commit adultery, don't use the Lord's name in vain, don't commit murder, don't have idols, don't worship any other gods. Keep the Sabbath, honor your mother and father, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. In the many years of working with youth and young adults, the question I heard from many of those kids and those adults was, what do I have to do to get to heaven? And what they were really asking is, what's the bare minimum I have to do to get that passing grade to be able to get into heaven? Some of us approach our workplaces like that too. How many years do I have to serve to get my pension? Well, the truth is that our commitment to God is much more than just a job or a way of being able to graduate. Faith is more than just obeying simple commands. What we must remember is that we do these things out of love, not out of just service. And it changes the nature of these commandments. They are no longer a chore, but rather they are a decision that we voluntarily take because our friend, because our brother Jesus has asked us to do so. We do this out of trust that God will be there for us. We do things not because we have to, but because we want to. And when we accept the love of God, shown to us through the example of Jesus Christ, and testified through the ages by countless saints and others who have come before us, our walk in faith is transformed. And like John Wesley, our hearts can be strangely warmed. And all it takes is listening to God telling us that he loves us. And he says, I love you, and you're my friend, you are my kin, and you belong in my kingdom. So church, can you hear that? Can you hear the cry of God telling you that you are loved? And so listen to what God is telling you, and may your hearts be strangely warmed. Amen.
Amen.
All right.